All right, little Star Trek.
Little Star Trek for the fans.
Hmm.
Question 775. Which high-ranking Klingon turned out to be the changeling imposter rather than the one in Odo's vision? Remember, we're in DS9 now.
Hmm.
So which
Hold
high-ranking
on.
Klingon?
Spoiler alert. Super spoiler alert if you're going to watch
I
this.
know, that's true, actually. Yeah, you should spoiler alert this. Which high-ranking Klingon turned out to be the changeling imposter rather than the one in Odo's vision? A. Worf. B. Martok. C. Kern, or D. Core? Well, I could
Personally.
fight you.
Good. But
All right, welcome to a piece of the action. I'm Micah.
I'm Eric.
and I'm Greg.
Caught Eric mid-drink there. And today we're going to be reviewing Imperial Struggle. Looks like came out in 2020. This is a two-player game designed by Ananda Gupta, Jason Matthews. The same designers, and I think it's a spiritual successor, right, to Twilight Struggle, which I think we have talked about, but I guess we have not reviewed. I felt
True.
like
We've never reviewed it.
I
Never
feel
reviewed it, but it possibly could have been in my top 10.
yeah, wasn't so.
Was it not, Greg?
No, it was.
It was. That's what
Yeah.
I
I
thought.
didn't, I didn't want to give away a spoiler in case people watch the
Yeah.
top 10s, but
Yeah.
it possibly
Um,
could have been.
All right. So, and I feel like, what was the one we reviewed where we had the picture of Cthulhu and Winston Churchill fighting?
That was Love Letter,
Okay. Yeah. Oh, right.
which is
Right.
nothing like this game at all.
Well, anyway.
Except in your mind, maybe.
So yeah. So my two thoughts about this game were that it was somehow related to that, and or that it was Star Wars based, since
No.
it was Imperial Struggle. But
No,
I-
you thought
Oh my God.
Churchill was related.
yeah. Was Churchill not part of Star Wars canon? Did I get that?
Yes, and
I'm all over the
Churchill was not in the Second Hundred Years' War.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm not a big history buff, so say it. Okay. So, and runtime of 2 to 4 hours for this game. So you guys have been playing it, got a few games under your belt with it now, and ready to give us your thoughts. So let's go ahead. I guess first of all, we'll get into basic premise and rules. Greg, if you want to take off with that.
Sure. Yeah, just a super high level overview here. This is a pretty complex game. But yeah, as I mentioned, this is the Second Hundred Years' War, which is played out over 6 peace turns that are broken up with 4 war phases. And essentially the wars in this game are really just kind of scoring rounds that happen in between the peace turns. The board is the globe that's divided up into 4 regions, and on each of your peace turns, each of you are drafting these action tiles that give you 3 types of actions. So for example, we have commerce and political, which are they're different systems, but they're basically ways of getting influence into these regions. And then there's a military action that you can take, which also helps with influence, but is also a good way of helping you protect some of the influence that you have on the table. And also helps you with the wars that are coming up. And at the end of each of those peace rounds, there's a scoring phase that's at the beginning of each round, you kind of flip over these tiles randomly that give scores for different regions and also for different commodities that you could be going into. So at the end of each peace round, those are all scored. And then each war is scored. Each war has 4 different fronts, and they all score in their own way, depending on different things that you're setting up for in the peace turns. So that's the basic gist of the game. But on top of that, there's also event cards that you have that you can play that affect the board in some way. There's ministry cards. You choose 2 of those at the beginning of each of your turns, and those kind of give you a special power over the course of that turn. That's what you're doing until the game will end. At the end of all 6 peace turns and that final war scored, whoever has the highest score wins. Or there's like this tug of war style scoring track. If anyone hits the 20 points on their side, the game will end then. That's a super high level overview of the rules. There's much more to it though.
Okay, well, cool. So we'll talk about the theme. Eric, maybe you want to speak to this. I know that I'm kind of curious about this, especially in comparison to Twilight Struggle, which we have talked about before, because it seemed like I know you. It seemed like you guys felt with that game that the theme that it really did a good job of sort of implementing that Cold War feel. So I'm wondering how this one stacks up.
Well, we haven't actually reviewed Twilight Struggle. We've discussed it probably a few times, and honestly, like after I talk about the theme, we'll have to kick it over to Greg because he's played a lot more of Twilight Struggle. I've played 3 games of it, and like 2.5 of them were online and don't really count as far as the feel of the game, I don't think. So yes, you were right. That is a spiritual successor. They've been throwing that term around for a couple of years now. In my plays with Greg, who has a lot more experience with Twilight Struggle, he seemed to think that there wasn't much in common. So I don't know. We'll have to hear what he has to say. But as far as the theme of this is concerned, with the vibe of the 100 Years' War, which was primarily France versus Britain, that's what we're dealing with, and all of the many mini wars that were involved in that. Most people have heard of like the War of 1812, French Indian War. That's all part, or the War of the American Succession, War of American Independence. That's all part of this 100 Years' War. So there's like lots of mini wars that people know about that are baked in to this war. And as far as the theme is concerned, I think it does a fantastic job. I think it's really, really good at its theme. So what I wrote down here is I think that besides RPGs, tabletop RPGs, and RPG style board games, like say Gloomhaven or Vindication or anything like that, that's designed to get that tabletop RPG feel, I think this is as good as you're going to get when it comes to a thematic, pure strategy game. I think this is not. This is a board game that is not trying to make you feel like a particular person, but this is about as thematic as it's going to get, in my opinion, for a game that's just strategy. I love it. I think the theme is great in this game. A big thing that helps with regards to the theme that probably doesn't do anything for Greg is the map is just so beautiful. It's really gorgeous. The map looks like one of those like multi-circuit, I don't know what they're called, but like the maps, the world maps that are like made up of multiple circles, to get more realism in the globe. That's what the map looks like. It's really pretty. That helps. It makes me feel like I'm making decisions on a map. Like yes, send those people to the Caribbean. Kind of a situation. The other thing that helps and that will be familiar to those who have played Twilight Struggle is the events. Now the events are not the same. They're not because correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but events in Twilight Struggle, it's been a long time since I played, but events in Twilight Struggle they double for action points basically, right? So you use them, but when you use them, they activate for the other player as well, right?
Well, so there's different event cards. There's Soviet events and U.S. events, and there's neutral events. But if you you can always choose to play the event for the action points instead of the event, unless it's your opponent's event.
That's right.
You get the action points, but they get to play the event anyways. So
that's right.
So you can't sneak around that getting played.
Yeah. So it's different in this. Events are, I guess, you could think of it as more watered down than Twilight Struggle, because I'm gonna do that at some point. Twilight Imperium versus Twilight Struggle, but they're more watered down in the sense that events are just like bonus things that you can do on your turn if you meet the requirements. So the thing about events, they do help with the theme. But there's a balance that I think that they strike that is pretty impressive, where they aren't mandatory, like in Twilight Struggle, where if you play them, like in Twilight Struggle, I think you have to play your hand out. You do not have to do that here. So you can keep cards behind. You don't have to play the events. Also, you don't play an event and it helps the other person ever. So the other player is not going to be assisted. So they are different, but they do offer bonuses that you can take if possible. Now those bonuses are extremely themed. They're very thematic. So if you wanted to dig into the history of what all these cards do, they will assist you in immersion, in feeling the story of the game. You don't need to know what the story is behind the card, but there's more theme waiting for you if you dig into it and if you want. Anyway, I guess my ultimate point is that you can play this game like almost like an abstract strategy game if you want. The theme does not get in your way of doing that, which is, I don't think it's unusual, but I wanted to highlight it.
Yeah, is that a positive for a theme or a negative?
Well, here's my point. My point is that it doesn't get in your way, but if you want to imagine yourself like as a 16th century European king, this game gives you all the tools to do that. And I think that balance is incredibly cool. Like where you can play it as just a straight up strategy game, or you can immerse yourself if you want. And I don't know. I'm sure there's other games out there that hit that same sweet spot. I can't think of any. I think this is a really beautiful game for that reason alone. The way it hits that theme, or the way it lets there be theme if you want to get into it, but it's not going to. Now, my plays on Twilight Struggle are limited, but I felt like Twilight Struggle, I almost needed to know. Like the theme maybe got in the way a little bit for me because I didn't know anything about the Cold War. Take that with a huge grain of salt, as I always say, because I don't have any plays of Twilight Struggle under my belt. But this game, at the very least, doesn't do that. It doesn't get in the way of the theme. Doesn't force itself upon you, but it's there if you want it.
Okay. So I kind of have, well, I think I have a question about that, but I think it's going to overlap with feel of play too. So why don't I go ahead and open it to that? And I think what you're talking about already is kind of overlap to a degree, but they always do. So, what do you guys think as far as feel of play? What does it feel like to play Imperial Struggle? Greg.
Yeah, it's interesting that we are referring to this as the successor to Twilight Struggle. See, I should have said something like Imperial Twilight. We already did that joke in the Hands in the Sea review, so I'm not gonna repeat it here.
between Twilight Struggle and Twilight Imperium, and Imperium sounding like Imperial, it's gonna.
It's okay.
You guys see the title of the video, you know what game we're talking about.
Anyways, because it is a successor in ways, and I see the bones there. Like I get why it's called that. And it's the same designers. It's called Struggle. It's got it in the title. But I'll be honest, if I wasn't told that it was a successor to Twilight Struggle, I don't think I would have noticed it. I would just have seen this as another, heavier game based on conflict. Because I do think it's different. Because I think Twilight Struggle, for me, it did capture the Cold War. Mostly, not historically speaking, although there's definitely events that are from that era. It's funny because Twilight Struggle is almost non-historical because it kind of pushes like the whole domino theory and stuff like that. Like it specifically chooses things for gameplay purposes. But one thing it does do is it very much gives you the feeling of the tension of that era. 100% you get that. You feel like you're on the brink of a nuclear holocaust at any given time. It does give that. I don't feel that's in this game. I feel like, and it makes sense. This is not the Cold War we're covering. We're covering the Second 100 Years' War. It should feel more like the Second 100-Year War. So yeah, I do think it feels different. I think I've already talked about the feel of play here, whereas I always saw Twilight Struggle as, and I'm going to use Twilight Struggle as a reference point, even though I don't think it's hugely related, just because it's an easy game to reference and to compare with. And it is a spiritual successor. But I think the biggest difference, I always saw Twilight Struggle as kind of in the middle of a war game and a Euro game, a strategy game. It kind of, I've always felt it kind of, and this is a big topic of debate, by the way, among war gamers. They will fight to the tooth and nail that Twilight Struggle is not a war game. But I always felt it was, at the very least, it's on the border. I think Imperial Struggle takes that system and, in my mind, turns it more into a heavy Euro game. I feel. I feel this is getting into heavy Euro game territory to me, where you're interacting with a bunch of systems. It's interesting because Eric was talking about how he hasn't thought of another game where you're interacting with where you can look at it as a strategic game, but also interact with it that way, but also the theme is there and you can interact with the theme that way. Eric, have you ever played a Vattel Lacerda game? Just out of curiosity.
I believe so. Name the big ones off.
Vigno is the one I have. Kanban, the Gallerist.
I know what you're talking about. No, actually, I have not.
I'd be curious to see how you react to his games, because in my mind, this is very different than a Lacerda game for sure. There's different. He has certain trademarks that are not in this game, but I get very similar feeling when I play this, where I'm interacting with a bunch of systems, and all of those systems are kind of there for a thematic purpose. That's kind of the feeling I get. So if I were to sum up the feel of play of this game, that's what it is. I feel like it's a thematic game that's getting there via a bunch of systems, similar to how like a heavy thematic Euro game would. So that's where I stand.
Okay. Eric, what about you? Anything, like I said, you touched on it already, but anything more to say about feel of play?
So for me, the thing that stood out to me when I was playing this for the first time, and still, is the tension. I know Greg said it's not as tense as Twilight Struggle. I have to take his word for that. I think that the tension is, well, it's not tension as much as it is when your opponent takes their turn. It's two-player games. So when your opponent takes their turn, it feels like they've just won the game. Like, it always feels like they have just destroyed you every single time. And then you take your turn, and I assume it feels that way for the other person. Like, for me, I thought that was a really cool feature of the game, where it's just so like, oh, I can't believe it. Oh, no, I can't do the thing. And then you do your thing, and they feel the same way. And that maybe that's not tension as much as it is like swing or what have you. But the game is built, obviously, it's built to facilitate that, and I think that's kind of cool. So it feels very tense is the word that's coming to my mind, but I don't want it to overlap with that kind of like constantly on the verge of nuclear disaster tension that both players feel in Twilight Struggle. It's a different kind of tension.
Well, it's curious you mentioned that about the two-player. That's kind of the question I had, is that so Twilight Struggle, Imperial Struggle, both two-player games, both centered around, conflicts that are obviously two-sided, so it makes sense to sort of limit it to that. Do you feel like, do either of you have any thoughts on this as a two-player game? Do you feel like, I guess what I'm wondering is it easier to get that kind of tension or that kind of feel in a two-player experience, or not necessarily? There are other things at play here that make that work, or is it like, because it's a two-player game?
Like as opposed to a multiplayer game?
Right.
Well, maybe this is cheating, but I think that there's that same kind of tension in Quartermaster General 1914. But it is technically, it's team versus team, so I suppose you could say that it's still two-player. But there is that feeling of like, how am I going to come back from this in Quartermaster General, and that plays up to, what is it?
5, isn't it? I think it's 5.
5.
I think it's like 3 versus 2 or something.
What do you think about that comparison, Greg? I know you don't like Quartermasters.
I guess when it comes to like providing that type of tension, it might be easier in a two-player game just because it's easier to make sure each of the other players, the other opponent has something that can keep the other player in check, I guess. But I don't think that feeling is exclusive to two-player games. It's a very different feel, but I mean, in a lot of, like Food Chain Magnate, I always feel like I'm on the verge of losing that game. There's a lot of swing in that game too. So I don't think it's exclusive to two-player, but I could see the argument being made it's easier to design that in a two-player game, just because it's easier to divvy up the tools to keep people in check, maybe.
All right, well, let's go ahead then. Let's go on to priorities and strategies. What are some things that you should want to keep in mind if you're new to the game, first time coming in? Why don't we start with you, Greg?
All right, first tip, don't listen to me and ignore my strategy section. I'm really bad at this game.
I'll take it from here.
Yeah, you don't.
I'm really bad at this game.
You don't need to open with that every time, Greg.
Yeah. Well, I generally feel I should open that every time. But if I'm thinking of like what I have gathered through my plays, I think where you win this game is you need to find synergies in a specific way. For example, there's all these different scoring areas I talked about. There's like the regional scoring, and then there's the commodities scoring, and there's the war scoring. I think you kind of got to look at all those paths and find out where's the intersections at. And those are the important places to try to go for because you're getting the most bang for your buck there. That's that, I think. Look for the good value there. And then the second one, the only other real thing I have to say is the sides are interesting in this game because I don't feel like they're unbalanced or all. I don't even really think they're all that asymmetrical per se. They are to a degree. But I think the asymmetry really ratchets up as you play. Like as you start gaining different abilities and as you start populating the board, I do feel like, and it's not even like the same each time for each side. Like I feel like it just over time, you'll have some sort of an asymmetric advantage. And I think once you're able to identify that, then just hammer in on that. Find out where your advantage is becoming in that game and hammer home on that. That's really the only thing I can think of. Yeah, look for the good value in your scoring, and then look for where your asymmetric advantage is coming from.
Make the line go up.
Make the line go up. Yeah, that's really it. That's all I got. I'm bad at this game though, so.
Okay. Well, Eric, what have you got for us?
Well, you certainly don't want to make the line go down.
Okay.
So I agree with Greg.
Yeah, and let me just say, if you would like more of these unparalleled gems of board gaming wisdom regularly, you should feel free to subscribe to us for more top tips like that.
Oh yeah, we got days and days of this stuff.
Yeah.
Priorities. Okay, here's my takes on this, and I've played more than Greg, but I'm by no means an expert, but I do think that Europe is interesting. And the reason for that is, okay, let me explain for those who haven't played. There's 4 regions. There's Europe, there's North America, there's the Caribbean, and there's India. So those are the 4 areas that you're allowed to play in. Europe is interesting because 2 reasons. It has a lot of prestige spots. Prestige is an extra way of getting points. There's really, as Greg mentioned, there's only 3 ways of getting points. There's only 3 ways of getting VP. That's regional awards, global demand, and wars. But there's a little subcategory in regional awards called prestige. And so you can get a regional award, like if you have the most number of flags in Europe, you get the regional award. But if you have the most number of green spaces in Europe, you also get a prestige award. Green spaces are like super sexy areas that like really cool things that very influential areas of Europe. Europe has the most of those. In fact, I think Europe has the only prestige areas. Now that I think about
that's the only place.
There might be some outside that unlock later, but I'm not sure. So the reason that's important is that while the regional awards are randomly doled out, so every turn, those 4 areas that I mentioned are going to have different values randomly assigned to them for having the most number of flags in that region. However, Europe always has a static +2 if you have the most number of green spaces, the prestige spots. So it's always +2. 2 victory points if you take those. That makes Europe a very important spot because you know that you can always get 2 victory points. Low scoring game, by the way, not very high scoring. You know that you can always get 2 victory points if you take those prestige spots. So fighting in Europe is really important. You don't want to, neither player wants to let Europe go completely. You need to fight over. It's almost kind of like in a World War I analogy. It's the trench warfare. It's the Western Front. You can't let it go. You might not win the game that way, but you need to pay attention to it. So the other reason that fighting in Europe is important is because that's where the best advantage tiles are. You get advantage tiles from controlling certain spaces. And if you control certain spaces, you get a little tile that goes onto your player sheet. And that lets you do a thing every turn, like create conflict somewhere or reduce your debt or what have you. The best advantage tiles are in Europe. So there's multiple reasons to focus on Europe, in my opinion, because of prestige and for advantages. And then the second thing that I would recommend is if you're going to go for prestige and advantages in Europe, you also want to make sure that you're getting victory points from wars. Wars are sometimes forgotten about because it's a whole separate board. You have to kind of go over and look at them and calculate your points. But the wars are so cool in this game because you can see them coming. You can do the calculation where you can count the number of points that you already have, but then you have hidden war tiles that you can purchase throughout the game to like bolster your side that your opponent doesn't know what their value is. Wars can give you lots of victory points and also can give you conquest points, which are the most powerful currency in the game. Conquest points are incredibly powerful. They let you take over entire, now I'm going to forget the name, not provinces, but anyway, very, very important sections of the board. They also let you take over forts, and conquest points are where it's at. But they're very rare to get. You get them through wars. So I think as a starting player, focus on Europe and focus on wars. Now, if fighting in Europe is too hard, the next thing that you need to pay attention to, obviously you can't 100% ignore any of the other 3 regions. So the third suggestion that I would make would be your next priority after fighting in Europe and bolstering your wars through bonus tiles would be to find the region that has the most VP to win between awards and global demand. So both of those things are randomized. You've got random awards for each region, but you also have like global demand, which is commodities. And so find the area that has the most of those things together. That would be your third priority. Yeah, I think there's a lot to this game. I mean, I don't think it's a terribly complex game. You really only do have three main areas for victory points, but there's a lot of gears that you can turn. So yeah, those are my points.
As far as complexity goes, I think PGG said 2 to 4 hours. That sound about right to you guys?
Yeah, actually it does.
That makes sense.
Okay. All
what's the complexity on it? Does it say?
It was like 3. I think it was like 3.98 out of 5.
Yeah, 3.98.
Yeah,
almost a 4.
Yeah. So
which sounds about right to me.
Sounds about right. Okay.
Maybe a little high.
It might be a little. I don't think it's quite that high, but it's around there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. All right, well, let's go ahead then and get into the good and the bad. What did Imperial Struggle do well, and what could it have done better? Eric, let's start with you.
Man, I couldn't really come up with a distinct list for good. I have some bad points, but the good is just it's just a really good game. Like I don't have much to say on this topic because I think that for me it hits all of the it fires on all cylinders kind of. It's a deep strategy game with a lot of theme built in. Um, it's it's complex, but it's not hard. It's complex, but it's like pre-chunked. You know how people they'll
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
learning how to memorize things. You know, you got to chunk things. It's a mnemonic thing. Um, Everything comes in like, okay, are you in the Europe section? Are you looking for? Are you looking at the war board? You know, it's pre-chunked. It's easy to grasp once you understand the basics. So it's not too hard to learn. It's at first I thought it was kind of a bear to set up and break down, but once I got my storage in place, I think that took care of itself. I don't think that's actually a problem anymore. It's actually not that hard to set up and break down. Oh, it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful game. Very good looking. What else do I have to say? As far as all my my five categories of things that I always look for, the game is extremely engaging. I constantly am like on my turn thinking, well, I could do this, I could do that. There's multiple options on your turn, but I don't think that it doesn't suffer too much from AP. The opportunity is there certainly for you to overthink things, but I don't think it's not a given that has to be true. Um, People's turns are interesting. Like I know there's only one opponent, but every time your opponent takes a turn, it feels like a gut punch, and you definitely are engaged when it's not your turn. So many choices, and yeah, that's my good. I mean, I know it's kind of vague, but I really enjoy this game.
Okay. This kind of hits all the buttons for you. Greg, good. What did you like about it?
Well, the first thing I like is I always appreciate these games, excuse me, where what Eric said, how thematic the game is and how deep of a dive it takes into the theme. One of those things I talked about with, for example, High Frontier. Typically, this is done in like war games. Like if you really want to explore like a war, then you can find some game out there that explores that war or that battle in depth. I wish there were more games that did it outside the context of war. I know this is called the Second Hundred Years' War, but this is not really about the war. It's more about that period of history. And I appreciate that it's taking that look into that theme. I just like it. Um, I think I would enjoy this game more if I knew more about the Hundred Years' War. I'm actually probably Second Hundred Years' War, but I'm more familiar with the Cold War, which is one thing I appreciate about Twilight Struggle. I mean, I lived through part of the Cold War, and with the Second Hundred Years' War, like I know pockets of it. Like I know about the French Indian War. I know about obviously the American Revolutionary War and some of the stuff about the Napoleonic Wars. But as a whole, I've never got around to that like in my just casual history studies. So I think if I ever were to get into that just on my own, I would definitely want to come back to play this again, with that new the thematic vocabulary in my head. So I do love that I love any game that does that. That's a way for me to learn about a real life subject through playing the game. I always appreciate that. Beyond the theme, I think there's just a ton here. If you're looking for a game that you can buy for two players that's going to last you a long time, I think there's plenty of depth here to explore. Like I think you could play this over and over again and be finding new things to look at. I think this is the kind of game where I think, especially if you had the same player for a long period of time, I think you could start building up a sort of a language in this game that you could use back and forth. I just think it would become really interesting to see how the strategies develop over the long haul. I think this game can hold up to that many plays. Within the game itself, I really do kind of enjoy that whole peacetime, wartime thing. Like there's this whole peacetime thing that have their own internal scoring phases, but you're also needing to set up for that wartime phase. And I feel there's interesting back and forth there, this whole swing that goes on there, where you do the peace, the war happens. You have another piece and you're setting up for another different war with different things. That happens. I love that back and forth. It's super cool. The event cards in this game are interesting. I do. Eric said he thought maybe they were watered down from Twilight Struggle, and I do think they are, just because Twilight Struggle is such a huge part of the game. Like Twilight Struggle to me was very much a CDG, like that card-driven game. I don't think this is as much, but they are interesting still because they require preparation. Like you can't just play one and have it happen. Like there's certain things that need to be set up for an event to work right. Like there's the regular event, but in order to play the event, you got to like draw the chit that matches the symbol sometimes. And sometimes there's also like a bonus that you get. So you got to make sure you're set up for the bonus to take effect. But man, it's really cool. Like when you get all that working and you play the event card at the right time and you got all that working for you, it has such a huge impact on the game. And I just find them to be kind of interesting. So even though they just take more preparation than Twilight Struggles did, I think, to get that impact. But they're cool when they go off. So those are my goods.
All right, very good. Well, let's go to the other side of the coin and the bad. What do you think that it could have done better, Greg?
Can I ask a question real fast?
Yes.
Sure.
I have a question, Greg. So I mentioned in my section on theme that the theme, I think, gets out of the way but the first thing that you mentioned was that you think you would enjoy the game more. Do you think that if you knew more about the time period, do you think that that is to the point where, well, maybe you'll talk about this in your bad, but do you think that like you can do that? Do you agree with me that like you can still enjoy the game without the theme?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
I think because when I talk about games, there's always two values I get from them, right? I like a game that I can play for the strategy. That's my favorite thing to play a game for, but I can also play a game like a war game just for the theme and not necessarily care about the strategy so much if I am gaining something from the theme. So now if you get a game like this where you can get both of them going, I feel like I got, even if I don't care for the strategy as much, I can still enjoy the theme. As far as how much I enjoy the strategy, I'm going to get into some of that right now. uh, so here's one little confession about our review structure. I always have a little bit of I always brush up a little against I know we do it to make things organized, but our good and bad sections, I'm always hesitant to call certain things bad because I don't think these are bad things. And even more so than any other review, I think these are very personal to me. It's just like a weird way my brain works. I don't think these are bad. I think some of these people, a lot of the stuff people will love. I feel like I'm on the side where when Eric reviews a Splatter game, where it's like, this isn't bad. I appreciate what it's doing. It just doesn't work in my brain. The only bad I have about this game that I can say that I think is a little bit more objective is maybe the rule book. I think the rule book in this game it was pretty hard for me to find things sometimes. I don't think it clarified everything. I feel like I had to go to BGG to get certain things answered. I do think the rule book could have been a little better in this game. So that's the only like bad I have that I would consider bad per se. The rest of this is just very personal. This is just my own thing. And it's interesting doing this game. It reminds me of when I reviewed other games that we reviewed that were inspired by games. So for example, Hands in the Sea, which was inspired by A Few Acres of Snow. City of the Big Shoulders, which was inspired by 18XX. And I had the same thing to say in those games where they took a game that I really enjoyed, that I thought was very streamlined and doing something interesting, and I felt they got by adding stuff to it, adding different systems, complicating it a little bit, and I think this is also doing that. And Hands in the Sea did it with a Few Acres of Snow, which is another game that I think kind of straddles that line between war game and Euro game. I felt Hands in the Sea kind of war game things up a little bit. City of the Big Shoulders, though, is probably a better reference because I thought it took a very elegant system in 18XX and Euro gamed it up. And I think that's what's happening here. It's like we got this I feel like Twilight Struggle is pretty streamlined and pretty focused. And I think this kind of Euro gamed it up, turned it into kind of a heavy Euro game. And I enjoy a heavy Euro game. I mean, I talked about Vitel Lacerda earlier. I have Vinu on my shelf. I can get into them, but they're not always my favorite way of playing. Just because I tend to prefer games that are more streamlined, that are giving me a lot more bang for my buck. So I feel like I need to maybe stop and talk about what I mean with this, because anytime you play a game that's mentally taxing, that mental load is going to come from a couple places. And if we simplify things, I think there's complexity and there's depth, right? I feel like some games, if you just throw enough systems at it, you have a lot of your mental overload is just dealing with the systems, right? Whereas in a more streamlined game, I feel like you're getting straight to the depth immediately. You can access it right from the get-go because the rules just disappear, right? So that's kind of how I feel. I feel like, is the mental load coming from holding all the systems that are in your head and all the things that are going on, or is it letting you get to that decision tree immediately? That's kind of what I enjoy. I happen to, I mean, I just engage with games quicker when I feel like they're more streamlined, and I think every rule is there to provide that strategic depth. I should say perceived strategic depth, because I don't know how much you can comment on a game's depth unless you've played it hundreds of times, but perceived depth. Do I feel like I'm interacting with it? So here's the bigger one for me, and I'm curious if anyone who's watching this, because I don't think I've talked about this before, uh, has a similar hangup with this, because here's something I have realized as I've played games over the years that I really like in a game that this game doesn't have, and that is scoring goals. I like games where the goal of the game is very focused, and the paths to get to that goal are multitudinous. So for example, just to throw one of my favorite games, Food Chain Magnate. Obviously, obviously the goal of most games is victory points, but how do you get those victory points? In Food Chain Magnate, it's sell food to the neighborhoods that want food. That's it. That is the only way to score points in that game. Now, how do you do that? Well, that's the game. There's hundreds of ways to do that. That's what you need to figure out. But the goal for all of us is exactly that same thing. There's no mini games over here. There's no okay, but I can also make money by doing this thing over here. And I can also make money by doing this thing over here. I prefer when the goal is very clear. Again, this is very personal. I don't know why my brain works better with those types of games, but they do. So then let's talk about Twilight Struggle. Did that do that? I think to a certain degree it did, because in Twilight Struggle, the only thing that was really in there was influence. And there was 6.5 regions kind of that got scored in that game. But in the beginning, there's only 3 regions in the first phase. 3 more got added on in the game. And the way that game worked, you drew the scoring card and you had to play it the turn you drew it. And that gave you information about which ones are going to get scored. You know, if you had it in your hand, you knew it was going to get scored. If your opponent had it, you could maybe tell from their play where they were playing at that maybe they had it in their hand. Or it could have been the discard pile, then you knew it wasn't coming out for sure, right? So you had some information that kind of narrowed those choices down. But that was it. All it really cared about was influence. That was your only thing you had to really worry about, was getting influence. So Imperial Struggle, it's funny that Eric said you only have a couple regions to worry about, because if I count these up, okay, so the most direct ancestor to the influence in Imperial Struggle is the markets. The markets work the way influence works in Twilight Struggle, where you spider out from your locations, and then you can start taking down the markets of your opponents when you get close to them. Okay, but every single turn, there's 3 randomly generated commodities you have to worry about. So that's 3 regions. So we're kind of already tied with Twilight Struggle. Then on top of that, there's another system on top. There's 4 regions regionally that you have to have influence in. And all of those are kind of random point generators. So that's another 4. So now we're up to 7 that you also have to worry about. Then there's the prestige layer that's also on top of Europe. That's kind of its own little thing. It's another little sub-layer of Europe. So now we're up to 8 systems. Then every single turn, there's a war with 4 fronts, and each of those fronts care about different types of scoring. So now we're up to, 12 different scoring regions that you're kind of constantly balancing in your head. Now, I think that can be interesting. I get why people like that, because it's like, okay, so you got to figure out which of those are the things you can win, which of those can you fight for. I don't know why I have a hard time with this. And the best way I thought I could illustrate it was like making like a toy game. Let's say, like, just to simplify a game, let's say a game has just a single region and you're playing a very simple area control game in it. Obviously, if you have one region, that region is the most important. You lose that region, you lose the game. So obviously, everything is going to that region. If you have two regions, well, now it's like, okay, I can't lose both. If I win both, I win the game. I could lose one and then my opponent wins one, that would be a push. So they're both super important. You get up to 3, now it's like, okay, I can win 2 of these regions and I'll be pretty far ahead. I can afford to lose one, but it's not ideal. But it's still getting, you got to 4, you start seeing how each of the regions you add start. Now I get 4. If I can get 3, I can ignore that last one. 3 is really a big deal. That's 75% of the points. As you start adding more and more regions, there starts to become regions that you can start to be like, you know what, I can't do anything with this. I'll ignore it. So now every region isn't as important. You can start ignoring regions, and I feel like I do that in this game where it's just some points I go, I don't got the resources to fight there. I don't think that's important. I'll just ignore it. Or that's my opponent. I'll give that to him. And I prefer it when games are like, no, everything is important. Everything you do is important. And that's the best I can describe it. I feel like this game just kind of adds too much scoring. And to me, it's the difference between what I like in those games, the focus scoring versus, say, a point salad game, like, Castles of Burgundy, where you get points for.
Yeah, that's what I was going to sound like. It sounded to me like you were describing a point salad,
think,
right?
This is definitely not a point salad game.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call it that, but it's
but
it kind of is similar, right? Where it's like you get points for doing this, you get points for fulfilling this region, you get points for putting animals down, you get points for shipping. There's all these different places you can get points. So it just, I don't know why. I bounce off those types of games in general. So I don't think this is a point salad, but it's the same deal where I'm just having to worry about too many end goals, I guess. I don't know why it bothers me, but it does. And I can see why it's interesting to evaluate which one of those regions you think is important. Then let's go on. So Twilight Struggle, I talked about, I like that because it was so tense. And the reason why it's so tense is because in that game, you basically live in DEFCON 2. Like you're constantly at the bridge, the brink. You feel like, Eric said, like in this game, you feel like you lost the game each turn. But I get what he's saying, but at the same time, at most, I feel like you're losing a couple points back and forth. I almost feel like in this game, it's a game of you're nicking each other back and forth. Like, oh, you got a point or two. Oh, I got a point or two now. Oh, you got a point or two. Okay, I got a point or two. And eventually, I think what happens is someone starts to gain momentum and those nicks start to add up and eventually it starts getting rolling and yeah, then you lost the game. I think that can happen. But I feel like Twilight Struggle is just every turn mattered so much because it just felt like any turn could end the game. Whereas here, I don't get that feeling, I guess. So there is that. Then there's also an issue this game that I don't think this is bad, but just something to keep in mind. It shares with Twilight Struggle, and that is, I think a new player in this game will get decimated by someone with experience. I actually think that's a good thing in the game. That doesn't bother me. But just go in knowing that if you play this game a number of times, you're going to destroy a newbie. Just because they know the decks better, you know what's going on, you know what to focus on. My last negative I want to say is this game is fairly random at times. Sometimes I just drew event cards and they can be really swingy. And then sometimes I draw event cards I just don't care about. Or sometimes the goods will just get flipped over. And oh, it just so happens to be the 3 goods that I was strong in last time, so I'm still strong in them. Or whatever, and or the point markers get flipped over in the regions, the same thing. Oh, that one thing I was really going into got as a 0 this turn, so it doesn't matter. And you can't really predict any of that. It's just kind of random. I don't know. That always kind of bothers me slightly. But yeah, so I think that's where I'll end there. Again, I think I get why people like all that stuff. I completely get it. And that's why I said this is kind of like a Vattel Lacerda game. And I have similar issues with Vattel Lacerda games, actually, if we ever review one of his games, where I just think there's the mental load comes more from the complexity than it does streamlined depth, which is more what I'm looking for, I guess.
I'd like to review one of his games. I've heard, I don't know who he was, but there is a board game design reviewer, not well known, but his favorite set of games was Lacerda games. And Lacerda?
Lacerda, yeah, he has a huge following. Like,
yeah,
love his games,
and a particular look too to all of his games. And the Gallerist came up, and I thought, that maybe everything else that this reviewer liked, I was like, okay, yeah, I think we're thinking on the same lines, and so I really want to.
You talking about why you like this game made me think that you would actually like Lacerda. Now I have the old ugly Vino, the original copy. It's actually not ugly. I think it's a good looking game, but it doesn't have the same production values as his new big old Eagle Griffin games. But yeah, we should get one played.
All right, cool. Well, so there's a lot there. Eric, you want to talk about what you think it could have done better and also maybe respond because I know Greg mentioned some of your points directly. So any thoughts on what it could have done better though?
Yeah. So in response to some of what Greg said, I mean, he caveated all of it with it's just him. So obviously Greg's broken, and that's the end of the discussion. But I understand what he's saying. The main thing that I wanted to talk about was something that I don't know that I'm fully prepared to talk about tonight because I've been working on this subject and might come up with a short to do later on. But I think I've even mentioned this before. I've been working on this for too long, but just kind of mulling it over. Basically, like against elegance, and how elegance is not the end all be all. I think Greg danced around the word, but I think what he's talking about is what he would describe in other moments as elegance. You know, everything kind of focusing around one mechanic or something like that. And I understand why that's cool. I totally get that in game like Sekigahara and other games that I think very highly of. But there is a different way of thinking about games, and I think that I gravitate more towards those games where there's a lot of different things to master. And I think that's kind of cool to be able to almost specialize in, oh, I'm really good at knowing the deck, or I'm really good. I don't think this game is particularly a good example of what I'm talking about. I think it's kind of halfway, but there are certain games that are, you know, you can really focus on particular sub systems, and you play against so like a player can be really good at that. And I think that's better in multiplayer games, especially multiplayer team versus team games where one player on your team can be really good at a certain aspect of the game and you would rely on them for that. There's not a lot of room for that in board gaming, I don't think. If we ever talk about RPGs, I think that RPGs, for me, the coolest RPGs are ones that almost reject fully the sense of a desire to achieve elegance in the game system. I think that mini games in RPGs are a good thing. I enjoy them, and I there's some bleed over there in board games as well. So my main response to what Greg is saying would be just to push back a little bit on the elegance isn't everything. But again, he caveated that with that's just him, and I think that's our main disconnect when it comes to things like Food Chain Magnate and things like that too. So it's just us. It's just a difference there.
Yeah.
As far as bad,
which is why I
go ahead,
think
Greg.
Go is a great game, and Eric doesn't like it.
Go is beyond discussion. It's a totally different game. No, that's a valid point. That's like as elegant as it comes, right? Anyway, as far as bad is concerned, I agree with Greg that some of the rules are a little fiddly and the rule book might not be. I think the rule book is good once you've obviously once you know everything is, but it's not very. There's a learning curve there that could have been improved. Then I guess the only other thing I have to say about this game is going back to my 5 categories of what makes a good game. I dock this a little bit in the high 5 category. High 5 category is, can you feel awesome in this game? And especially early plays, your first few plays of this game, it's going to feel like you're just kind of riding the wave of the game. And because of the lack of randomness in the sense of Ameritrash style randomness where you're rolling dice and standing up and cheering, There's none of that in this game. There is some randomness in this game. I don't find it egregious at all, the level of randomness, but there's no randomness that makes you cheer, and there's not a lot of mechanics or elements of the game that do that, except I think if you were to play this more and as your knowledge of the game improves, I think you could set things up. I think the high five factor would get better and better. Basically, the more I played, the more I learned about the deck. Especially, there was this last game that we played. Um, I had been playing France previously, and then we swapped roles, and I knew that the France deck had this thing that you could do if France controls both Savoy and Sardinia, which are two like unnecessary, like they're not very valuable, right? They don't assist in any war. They don't get you anything particularly valuable. But if you see France going for those, you know that he has a card in his hand that will give him 3 victory points if he can get both of those. And so again, like that kind of thing where it's like you see the player doing that and you know what they're doing because you know the deck. Being able to set those things up or stop them from happening is a high five moment, but it requires knowledge that you don't have right off the bat. So my only bads would be that it might be kind of fiddly rules in some places, and that the high five factor isn't, at 10 from the get-go. But I think that would change with time.
Yeah, I think that holds that in common with Twilight Struggle too, because there's certain cards in Twilight Struggle that I actually pull out the deck and explain to new players in advance because they're so devastating if they don't know about them. I mean, obviously the War Games card, but even like the U.S.-Japan Peace Treaty card, where people can start pumping stuff into Japan, like, oh, hey, I got a card that gives the entire thing to me. Congratulations, you wasted your turn. So I like, if you don't know about that, though, it's a very bad feeling. So in Twilight Struggle, and I think the same is here, I almost feel like there's 2 phases to the game. There's like the games you're playing where you don't know about the deck and you're just kind of learning as you go. And then there's like a whole other game that opens up once you're familiar with all of that and you're not thinking about what's coming. You know what could come out. And I think the game plays very differently. And I think that's part of the longevity that this game has, is that part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just comment on what you guys are talking about, the like Greg, I understand what you're saying about the complexity versus depth. I think that's a good way to think about it. I feel like I can kind of go both ways. That I definitely appreciate the minimalism of Go, and like you said, being able to have a game where the rules are not part of the barrier at all. It's not what you're saying. But at the same time, I also feel like there is something to be said for a game where you can kind of get lost in the chaos and just have fun with it. I would just say those are not you're not playing the same sport when you're doing those things. Those are 2 totally different experiences that kind of get lumped in, under the heading of playing a board game, but really, it's just by virtue of it being an arbitrary category that they get compared together. So it's so anyway, interesting to see it broken down that way.
I think those things, I think most people would say, oh, that's Euro games versus Ameritrash. I think that's a better way of describing that divide.
No, I would say maybe German family games versus modern Euro games. That to me is the difference. It's interesting though, because I understand that, and don't get me wrong, I still like playing. I mean, I like High Frontier. I mean, I love that game. And I like war games and stuff like that. I mean, I'll play complex games and enjoy it, and I like complex RPGs. I have no problem with that. And it's funny, when I first started playing games, I actually was more drawn to the big complex games from rules complexity. I wanted to open up a box and just have tons of stuff in it. And actually, Vatella Serta was one of the very first types of games I beelined towards because of that. And I don't know what it was, but as I've played more and more and more, I just started appreciating the simplicity of, not simplicity, because I don't think Food Chain is a simple game, but I started appreciating more where the rules were able to just kind of like meld away pretty soon, and I could just engage with the game immediately.
Yeah.
I don't know what it
Yeah,
is. And
I don't think it's simplicity because I think it's just a question of where the complexity is,
well, that's what it is. Yeah, the
Yeah,
complexity is coming from me engaging with that
yeah,
decision tree,
right.
right? Immediately, not me trying to maintain a bunch of stuff in my head. And I even and for the reason I have Vino on my shelf is because sometimes I do like that feeling. You know what? I just want to play something where I'm just swimming in systems and rules, and that's fun. But overall, I prefer the more elegant games, I guess, where I'm getting more, yeah, depth from simpler or less rules, I guess.
Well, let's go ahead. We'll get into our final section now. The good, not the good and the bad, the conclusion, final thoughts. Um, you guys have said a lot about this game, a lot of thoughts on it so far. Is there anything that you have not said about this game that you want to say? What do you both rate it respectively? What is it? What do you want to do as far as putting it on the shelf? Let's talk to you first, Eric.
Nothing much that I haven't said already. I love this game. I was glad that somebody recommended we play it. This game was gifted to me, and but I had it on my radar for a long time, and it fulfilled what I wanted it to do. A good chunk of that is because I love history. I'll grant that. So if you're not into history, I should say, if you are into history, this game is going to be much more fulfilling than if you aren't. But I think the game is still really fun. Well, I know that I've played with people that aren't necessarily into history, and they had a great time with it. So I don't think it's terribly complex, but it is dense. I rate this a 9, and I definitely want it on the shelf. I realize that I'm going to get some. I want it on the 10. I know that's going to get some pushback. You know, I would kick Agricola, I would kick Codenames, I would kick Power Grid, but I know that Power Grid's not going to go because it's got too many, the player count's too high. I'd kick the Crew. I'd kick Estates. I love this game.
All right, Greg, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I thought about this for a while, but I think I'm giving this a 6.5.
Wow, is this you guys' biggest discrepancy?
No, I don't think so. I think
Okay.
our spotter games are bigger. But
Okay.
so just to reiterate, I'll just summarize why. It's mostly because I feel like, unlike Twilight Struggle, which I thought was a fairly streamlined game with a lot of tension, this modern Euro game, heavy Euro game, up that system a bit more. And I think there's just a lot of interacting with systems. I feel this is going more for the complexity of the systems. And the depth is there, but I do think you got to dig a lot more for it. And there's a lot more mental load you got to get through. And that's not generally what I'm looking for in a game nowadays. That being said, I think the reason why it's a 6.5 doesn't mean to re-clarify my scoring system. 6 and 7 is the range where I would still want to play, where I would still say, hey, I want to play this game. And I think where Imperial Struggle will come from, I agree with Eric that it's from liking history, and I do enjoy history. It just so happens this is a section of history I'm not super familiar with, because it just aspects of it I'm not familiar with, so I wasn't able to engage with it as fully on that level as I'd like to. So I think in the future, if like just through my normal studies, I'm like, hey, you know what? I understand the second 100 Years War more. I would love to come back to this game and try it again and approach it purely from that historical perspective and see what can I learn from it that way. So I think this time around I'm engaging it more as a strategy game, and on that end I just didn't like it as much. So that's why it's a 6.5 for now, with the caveat of going up. That being said, obviously with a 6.5, I have no desire to put it on our 10 game shelf, but you would have to make a pretty strong argument to put a 2-player game that's a single player count that I don't really care for onto our 10 game shelf. I just don't see it fitting.
Well, I could fight you.
You could, but I don't. Yeah, no, I'd be pretty against that personally.
I expected the pushback. I wasn't sure if you were completely going to nix any conversation about it.
I just like, you could probably convince me maybe if it had a wider player count, because again, this has got to cover so many systems. I don't want to be 2-player only games on that shelf, because I gotta have a game that supports people that come over. So I can't just.
What's closest for you? Like Agricola?
I like Agricola, and it plays 2 to 5. You know what I'm saying? Like
I'm
on
just
a
saying,
10
what's
game
the
shelf.
lowest on your 10?
Hold on, I gotta open up this shelf. I forgot what it even
What
looks
about the
like.
estates?
That's like a light partyish game. We already have heavy games on the shelf. I need games that are going to work for people that aren't into heavy games when they come over. And a 2-player game that I can only play with you is not it. It
I
just
understand. I
it just
understand.
doesn't give
I
me
what
enough
I what
flexibility.
I understand that like this is a different beast. You know, I have to make a push for a game that I love so much, but
Sure, I get
I
it.
understand that the 10 game list is not our favorite games. I honestly think that this might kick something off of my 10 favorite games of
Wow.
all time.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I understand. I'll leave the 10 game shelf and move on to the 25.
All right. 25. I'm a little more open to kicking something off.
I know it's the playtime is vastly different, but if you're looking at two-player games, I could get rid of Seven Wonders Duel.
Yeah, I don't mind that. I think I rate that as 6.52. So I wasn't as high in Seven Wonders Duel as you were. I hold on. Let me just double check because
Yeah, yeah.
our 25 game shelf is getting to the point where, again, I love heavy games. I prefer heavy games, but I don't want the entire shelf to be full of them. I gotta make sure we still have something for when people come over. And I think we do. I mean, we still have regular Seven Wonders even.
Well, I'll tell you what, you like Hands in the Sea. I enjoyed that,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd rather play this. Pretty much, I mean, it does the same things in my opinion.
I liked Hands in the Sea better, but not so much better that I would fight you too hard on that.
I mean, if I'm just pointing out things that are two-player, right? So
Yeah, so Seven Wonders Duel is kind of I don't really care for that game, to be honest. I'm
I'm fine
fine with
with
getting
getting
rid
rid
of
of
either.
Seven Wonders Duel.
I'm fine with either, let's be honest with you. I rate Hands in the Sea higher, but I also see the appeal of keeping something lighter on this shelf because it is starting to get pretty heavy. So I could see the argument either way. I'll let you choose. You can,
I mean,
I will allow either of those to get cooked off.
our shelves are going to lean heavier.
No, they
right?
will, and I'm fine with the 25 being mostly heavy. I just want to make, in my mind, I take this kind of seriously where I think about this is the only shelf I have in my house. And I think of these events where like people who are not gamers come over. I want to have something to play with them.
Sure.
So as long as I have a few things on there, I'm okay.
Well, I think I'd rather kick off Duel than Hands in the Sea
I'm
currently.
fine with that. I got Pandemic here. That's a good 2-player like game. The regular Seven Wonders is still here. Ticket to Ride's still here. Yeah, I'm fine. Let's kick off Seven Wonders 2. I think honestly that might be my lowest rated game left on the shelf. So
I really like Seven Wonders Duel. If you haven't played Seven Wonders Duel, you should definitely play it. But
it was good. I liked it.
Okay.
yeah, it's not exactly. It's a little apples to oranges because Seven Wonders Duel is so fast. But,
Sure.
But I get it. I get it.
All right. So goodbye, Seven Wonders Duel. And the 10 game shelf remains untouched. What are you guys going to play next time?
Oh, man, we didn't even talk about this, did we?
We haven't talked about honestly, if we could. So this is interesting because Imperial Struggle was like one of our highest thumbed games on our list. So by the way, just reiterate for those who are joining us the first time.
Yep.
Link in the description. There's a geek list on BGG where you can recommend games that we should review. Add a game or someone.
And see, we actually do it. So
yeah, and Imperial Struggle is actually one of our most thumbed games on that list, which is why we kind of pushed to get this one done. But I think PAX Premier Second Edition is our highest one. So
I can't find it anywhere. If anybody wants to send me a copy.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to get.
We'll review it.
So we can play that. It's been tricky. So I think we're gonna try to do that if we can find it. If not, then I don't know what we're gonna do.
What else is on the list? What's been thumbed up?
Hold on, let me look.
Oh, you know what? Oh, hold on. You know what we should do? We should either do PAX Premiere or we should do Through the Ages, which you've been wanting to play for.
I've been wanting to do Through the Ages, but that has like zero support on this list. No one cares about us reviewing Through the Ages.
I know, but we gotta do some stuff for us sometimes.
Yeah, or we might. I don't know. We've been doing a lot of heavy games. Maybe we'll do something light,
lighter,
just to get our turnaround time a little higher on these videos. We'll see. I think if we can do PAX Premiere, we'll do it. But if not,
it'll be a surprise.
maybe we'll throw a surprise in there before.
Okay.
So, it depends on if we can get tax free or not.
All right. Cool. Well, here's hoping, I guess. All right. Well, so yep, just stay tuned for that. And until then, this has been a piece of the action.
I think I know this one.
I don't know. I'm in the middle of watching DS9, but I'm in season 4, so I haven't got there yet. I forgot who it was.
But you must have. This is early.
Is it?
Well, it's not early, but
No, I don't
feel
think
like so. I feel like if there was an episode where the guy that we thought was Worf the whole time was the changeling, I think that
Pretty
would
sure it's
stand
not.
out. I
It's
think
not
that would
Worf.
stand out, right? So,
Yeah, it's
so
not
I don't
Worf.
think it's Worf.
For some reason my
Martok-
head says Martok just because, but
Yeah, so that's where I went to, just because the name Martok is recognizable. But I think actually that's a strike against it. I feel like I feel like the fact that I feel like it's got to be some, or the other Core and Kern.
Core and Kern.
yeah, and they're all characters on DS9.
They are.
So I actually don't know this one. My memory is failing me. I don't think this is in season 4. I could be wrong because I feel like I would know this because I just
Eric,
watched
what do
it.
you think?
I think it's Martok.
That was for whatever reason my brain goes Martok.
So there's an episode with Core where, because Core was the actor who actually played Core in
Yes.
the original series. Remember? That
remember
was
that,
really
yeah.
cool.
That is super
Like
cool.
they get back one of the original Klingons.
Just for whatever reason his face got all bumpy.
Well, they actually explain that,
They
but
do, I know.
you gotta wait for Enterprise for that.
I know.
But which actually, honestly, I thought that was kind of cool, like
It
the
was.
way that they did it in Enterprise. But yeah, I think it's Martok. I remember this episode because nobody believes that that it's him. It's it's a red herring thing. They think it's somebody else.
All right. Well, see what it is.
Are you okay with me plugging in Martok?
Yeah.
I'll say Kern, since no one said Tim.
Okay, I was right. It was Martok.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it was
you
there was a big thing. It had to do with trying to win over the Klingons. They were suspicious, as is their way of, and they think it's somebody else, and then they come in and they blast the changeling while he's getting ready to knife somebody. Who's the guy? His name escapes me. The main guy, the main chancellor, Gowron.
Galron, the guy with the crazy eyes.
Yeah. That guy was born to play that role.
That guy was. Absolutely he was.